We will make a start. So just like to start by just saying good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are tuning in from Western Australia, and welcome to the Living in Australia 2025 Key Insights launch. My name's Daniel Evans. I head up the Community Views service here at Informed Decisions. I'll be your host for today, and we'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. I'm joining from Naarm or Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people on the call today. I can see many of our existing customers are online, which is wonderful. Welcome and thanks so much for your ongoing support. And I can also see some new faces or some names at least. So for those of you who we're meeting today for the first time, we really appreciate you joining us and we look forward to getting to know you better in the future. This is an annual launch, and we're really excited to share it with you each year. It's a chance for us to check in on Australians' values, what they think makes summer a good place to live, and how they experience those things where they live, and how those two things come together to understand local area livability. But most importantly, it's about surfacing what residents themselves are saying needs to happen to advance their quality of life. But before we dive too deep into the findings, let me give you a quick sense as to what we're going to cover today. I'll start with a little bit of scene setting and context. Then I'll briefly talk about ID, informed decisions, who we are, and why we care about these questions, and why we run our Living in Australia survey each year to support our Community Views service. From there, we'll get into the insights. We'll begin with overall livability, how Australians are feeling about where they live in 2025 and how that's changing over time, and how it looks across different local areas. And I'll then hand over to my most excellent colleague, Jackie Norton, who'll take you through what we've labelled the core four focus areas to advance quality of life. While these items are items that Australians consistently say matter most to them, Jackie will explain that our experiences of these attributes is heavily influenced by where we live, our life stage, and demographics. We'll then transition to questions and clarification, so please pop any queries or comments you have in the Q&A as we go. Andrew, who some of you met earlier, is monitoring those, and we'll gather around those towards the end. So if anything pops into your head, please pop it into the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer it. Everything that we share in today's webinar is explored in more depth in our Living in Australia report, which we're also launching today. That report will be emailed directly to you after today's session, as will the opportunity to connect with Jackie or I to explore how some of these insights can be useful for your local area place-based planning. I think it's important to acknowledge that by many measures, modern Australia is a success story. We've had generations of economic growth combined with political and civic stability, and those things together have created a reasonably high quality of life for a lot of people. But sustaining that success in the face of headwinds that include demographic change, climate pressures, digitization, and shifting cultural dynamics really requires some new approaches. So, what's worked for us in the past might not help secure our future prosperity. As Australia grows and changes, the concept of place is becoming an increasingly powerful force. Age, wealth, household composition, skills, and culture are increasingly becoming clustered by location. And that's reshaping not only the character of our local areas, but the current and future long-term needs of our communities. At the same time, cost pressures are forcing governments to rethink how they operate, with a keen focus on advancing productivity. But productivity in this context is not just about doing more with less, it's about focusing on what matters most and being able to have a measurable impact. And we're of the view that a lens on creating more livable communities is a sensible and powerful way to help drive productivity in place. As if you think about it, a productive economy really relies upon people being able to live well, to find housing near jobs, to access healthcare and education, to feel safe, to connect with nature, participate in community life. And when investment decisions, local area plans, and economic strategy align around community priorities, we believe it'll result in a higher quality of life across Australia's local areas over the long term, which will ultimately benefit us all in the collective. And at ID, that gets us really excited because over the last 25 years, we've helped government, essential services, and the private sector make better and more informed decisions. We focus on understanding how local area demographics and population dynamics, their past, present, and future, intersect with the economy and community priorities to match service demand with supply, uncover risks to and opportunities for future prosperity. For more than 300 local and other government agencies, they receive those insights online via our suite of digital solutions and consulting services. We do that to help ensure that they have a credible and contemporary evidence base for their decision making. For essential services in the private sector, we help by understanding spatial patterns of demand, whether it's service planning for primary schools across Melbourne or aged care facilities in Maroochydore. Our understanding of population dynamics, residential development, land release sequencing, and the labour force helps our customers to make better decisions about where and when to invest. One of the solutions we offer at ID is our Community Views social research service. I joined ID in 2021 to create that service to give governments and other organisations a clearer picture of the people they serve. At its heart, our service is really focused on building a credible resident evidence base to capture who the community is, their values, their needs, their lived experiences to help inform, monitor, and evaluate government's most important place-based decisions. And our approach is grounded in the strong principles of social research. We ensure robust survey design, credible data collection, and most importantly, the ability to turn that data into insights and resources to help decision makers focus on acting in the community's best interest. Since launching the Community View service over the last 5 years, we've been fortunate to work with a growing and diverse number of local governments to help ensure that their plans and their advocacy efforts reflect their community's priorities, while providing really clear ways to measure how the communities feel they're progressing towards council's longer term goals. A really important feature of our Community Views service is our annual Living in Australia survey. Each April and May, we collect the views of 5,000 Australians to understand how community values, experiences, and needs are playing out across the nation. And while living in Australia is really valuable on its own, and we make it publicly available, its core purpose and real strength lies in providing spatial benchmarks for councils and organisations who use community views. So in practice, this means when we survey 1,000 residents in Ipswich each year to understand how they feel about progress on council's strategic priorities, we can place those results in the context of national sentiment, and that gives Ipswich valuable insight into how local views compare with the wider community. And understanding community values and experiences to quantify local area livability and identify future needs is a really key component of both our Living in Australia survey and our Community View service, and that forms the feature of what we're going to talk through today. Our perspective is that any credible understanding of livability must really begin with the values and lived experiences of the residents themselves. So our approach uses 16 key attributes to reveal what people genuinely value about their local area. These attributes, as you can see on the screen, span a full spectrum of the community experience, from feeling safe to having access to affordable, decent housing, through to the ability to participate in sports and recreation and social cohesion. I developed this approach over 10 years ago in 2014, sorry, in response to what I was seeing was an endless supply of these livability rankings that came out of Europe mostly, that compared really large geographies against each other using these rigid top-down frameworks. While I'm sure that those lists really have their place, I feel that they miss a fundamental truth. And that truth is that different people in different places will hold different values and they'll report different lived experiences. And our method really puts those differences at the center of the conversation. So in practice, what we do is it works like this. First, we present those 16 attributes of livability to the people who are participating in our survey. We ask them to choose the 5 that they believe contribute most towards making somewhere a good place to live. And that helps us to really understand what's important to people in a community. And next, we present that full list of 16 attributes again to the survey participants and ask them to tell us how well they're experiencing those things, where they live on a scale between 0 and 10. And from that, we just quite simply learn what's going well and what's not going so well in people's local areas. The real insight, however, and the opportunity to make change kicks in when we combine those 2 steps. So we multiply the community's values by their lived experiences to calculate a local area livability index, and that's scored between 0 and 100. A score closer to 100 means that the residents are having largely positive experiences for the attributes that are of greatest importance to them. While that index is really helpful and a lot of our customers use it to monitor progress against their longer term vision, it's not overly instructive. What is instructive is our ability to identify community priorities and focus our efforts on policies that can affect positive change on those things that are of greatest importance to the community. So, how's livability playing out in Australia in 2025? We're looking at the results on the screen here, and I'll talk you through them. In 2025, the overall livability index for Australia was 59.5, and that represents a significant fall from what we observed in 63.4, and certainly a decline from what we observed in 2023 and 2022 when we first administered the survey in this way. This contraction really shows a shift in how Australians view their quality of life in their local areas, and it reflects an emerging sense of growing pressures across the nation. Jackie will explore why overall livability has contracted this year in more detail. She'll talk about for whom and what the community is saying we need to focus on to advance quality of life. If we just break Australia up into two groups for a moment, metropolitan Australia maintained a higher livability index in comparison to regional and rural Australia, but both declined in comparison to previous years. A really important focus of our community views work is in understanding how livability plays out across Australia's local areas and different communities. And while that focus for our customers is on exploring those dynamics at a really local level, the Living in Australia data gives us the ability to kind of step back and compare livability across Australia's metropolitan and regional areas. In 2025, we observed a really clear spectrum of livability across Australia's metropolitan areas, with the highest scores being concentrated in the ACT and Greater Sydney with 64.2 and 64.1 respectively. Perth and Adelaide then followed with 62.9. And then further down the spectrum, we saw Melbourne coming in with 60.6, Hobart at 58.1, and Darwin bringing up the rear at 52.6. It's worth noting that all of our metropolitan areas recorded declines in livability in 2024, with the steepest falls coming from Greater Darwin and Greater Melbourne. Greater Melbourne's overall livability in 2024 was 65.5. It's now 60.6, and Jackie will explain some of the reasons why in a moment. I think it's important to call out here, while we're focusing on the livability indices across metropolitan Australia, we don't have the regional and rural scores up. They will come up in a moment with Jackie. Regional and rural Australia offers many unique strengths and opportunities to advance quality of life, but no regional or rural Australia in our Living in Australia survey achieved a higher livability score than the metropolitan average, and that's a finding that's been consistent across previous years. So we're looking at some of the results here. So what actually created that 59.5 out of 100? When Australians are asked to nominate what makes somewhere a good place to live, we do see a really clear set of core values emerge. And these really gather around our most basic of human needs. So we're looking here at feeling safe. So 65% of the people we surveyed nominated feeling safe among the 5 things that they believe contributes towards making somewhere a good place to live. So it's the most important thing that Australians value, followed by the provision of affordable, decent housing, access to the natural environment, and high quality health services. So they make up our top 4. So that's the value set of Australians, the most important things. But if we look at how we experience those things where we live, we see quite a bit of variation. So access to the natural environment is by far the most positively experienced item, with Australians rating it 7.6 out of 10. And what this tells us is that something that we hold very dear is, for the most part, really positively experienced. That's great. That's something to celebrate, but it's also something to protect. If we flip that to the other end of the spectrum, we look at affordable, decent housing. This is where things really start to break down. Australians are giving their local areas an average score of just 4.5 out of 10 for affordable, decent housing, where 0 is very poor and 10 is excellent, which highlights it's not only a significant concern for many communities, but it also represents a real opportunity. So if over the long term we can get that right, we can make some gains, we can improve the housing availability, affordability, and accessibility, got the right stock in the right place at the right time, we should be able to see local area experiences improve, which by extension will put upward pressure on that overall livability index. Jackie will go into housing in more detail. Just while we're looking here at the most important features, just outside the top 4, we've got the provision of reliable and efficient public transport, which is the 5th most important item across Australia. Its importance, though, really depends on where you live. Metropolitan Australians place a lot more value on this than regional and rural Australians. And even as we look at metropolitan Australia, those closer to the CBD place an increasing importance on that topic. And finally, just down the bottom here, we see a bit of an interesting interplay between the value Australians place on a strong sense of community and social cohesion. Those two are kind of related. Regional and rural Australians tend to value and experience a strong sense of community more positively. Excuse me. And in contrast, people living in metropolitan areas and those who were born in non-English speaking countries tend to place a stronger emphasis on social cohesion. So that's looking at things really from a top-down lens. And what we're going to do now is focus on these core 4 items that we think need to be honed in on to advance quality of life. They're really highly valued everywhere, but communities experience them quite differently. Some thrive, while others face big gaps between what matters to them and how they're experiencing them in place. Jackie will explain that these items are quite interrelated as well, and improving quality of life in the collective really means not focusing just in one area. So Jackie, I'll hand over now for you to talk us through the core 4, how they're valued, how they're experienced, and where the greatest opportunities lie to strengthen livability across the nation.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. And thanks for everyone for joining online today. So we're really starting with one of the most universal human needs, which is the need to feel safe. And I think no matter where we live, I think we can all agree that if you live in the inner city, if you live in a small rural town, that feeling safe is really a baseline for a good life. I think it shapes how comfortable we feel walking down the street, whether we let our kids ride to school, how connected we feel to our neighbours and those that live around us, whether we choose to go out after dark or not, and things like whether we take public transport. And certainly feeling safe has consistently topped the list in terms of what people feel makes somewhere a good place to live over the past few years. In 2025, 65% of Australians picked it in their top 5 things they hold dear in their local neighbourhood. The bad news for livability in Australia this year is that feeling safe is highly important, but experiences, also the extent to which people actually feel safe, has decreased. So in 2025, Australians rated their experiences in their local neighbourhood of feeling safe at 6.2 out of 10 on average, which was a significant decline from 6.8 in 2024. And if we look at how it compares to the other 16 attributes, we see that feeling safe is the most important thing to people, but it's the 5th most positively experienced, which really presents a gap. And what we see is when we look at metropolitan Australians versus regional Australians, whilst they share the same average score, so both areas rate their local area on average 6.2 out of 10, when we zoom into those smaller geographies, we get lots of differences. So from a metropolitan perspective, residents in Sydney and Adelaide experience the highest levels of safety at 7 out of 10, followed by Hobart and the ACT. If you go further down the list in metropolitan Australia, you see that Greater Melbourne rated just 5.9 out of 10, which was a steep decline from 2024, and Darwin came out at just 3.3 out of 10. Within regional and rural Australia, we found that residents of southern New South Wales and regional South Australia felt very safe in their local area. Down the bottom of the list, we had the lowest safety ratings in regional Northern Territory at 2.8, so very low ratings of safety there, and as well in North Queensland at 4.4 out of 10. So one of the clearest trends in the data this year has been the rising concern about crime and antisocial behaviour and the increased focus on law and order. So this year, 36% of Australians nominated this as one of the top 3 challenges faced by their local area. And this makes it the 3rd most pressing concern behind cost of living and housing affordability. So that's increased by 10 percentage points in just 1 year. So that's a really big noticeable increase. And we've got some data around what residents are concerned about when it comes to these types of issues. We've got some open text responses. And, you know, a lot of residents are calling for tougher penalties, more visible policing, a focus around, you know, law enforcement. However, there's also this understanding that enforcement isn't always enough. People are also asking, how do we deal with the drivers of crime? How do we deal with youth disconnection, housing stress, and poor mental health? So the things that we know kind of underpin crime and safety. So Melbourne certainly stood out as an example of how acutely feeling safe or feeling unsafe can impact overall livability. So it recorded in Melbourne, we saw the largest increase in concern about crime and law and order. So that's that left graph that Dan's pointing to. So 40% of residents were concerned about this issue this year compared to a much smaller proportion last year, 24%. The middle graph shows how that manifests in terms of how people feel about safety in their local area. You can see in 2024 in Melbourne, residents rated their local area an average of 6.9 out of 10. That's now come down to 5.9 out of 10. And in turn, we see a lower overall livability index. So that 65.5 has come down to 60.6. So really it shows a clear example of how important our need to feel safe is in contributing to overall livability and things like quality of life, even how we feel our society is functioning. When people don't feel safe, it affects how they feel how they see their own social well-being. So this is a person's sense of connection, their sense of belonging, their trust in their relationships with others, and their trust in the broader community. So the relationship here is quite clear. So those that feel a low sense of safety in their local area, so they rated their sense of safety between 0 and 5 out of 10, had a significantly lower level of social well-being at 5.6 compared to someone who feels a strong sense of safety in their community, who rates their social well-being at 7.3 out of 10. So people do place an immense level of value on their safety. It underpins their ability to live, to work, to participate in everyday life with confidence. And we've seen recently that public perceptions can shift very quickly. So especially when we see high profile or seemingly random crimes dominate the media and the headlines, these incidents really strike a chord with people, not always just because of their severity, but particularly when victims seem relatable, or the settings are familiar, or it happens close by. So even if the crime rates overall, the data says that crime rates are stable, these big events can contribute to a growing sense of unease, and it erodes people's overall sense of safety in their community, which of course has flow-ons in terms of people's actual behaviours, so where they choose to go and how they choose to spend their money and their time. So we're very fortunate, as Dan mentioned, to work with local councils across Australia to understand the things that matter most in these communities. In the city of Canning in Perth's southeast, feeling safe was the top priority for them in 2023, which was when we last measured it in that local area. So in Canning, 76% of residents found safety important, which was significantly higher than the national average across Australia at the time. Residents rated their experiences of feeling safe in their local community at 6.2 out of 10. So that came as the 11th most positively experienced attribute. So you can kind of see that gap between importance and experiences. So in response, the City of Canning's 2025 to 2026 better budget strategically channeled substantial resources into public safety. They funded Community Safety Service, which offers 24/7 assistance for community safety issues. They expanded their CCTV network and maintained the popular security incentive scheme, which essentially provides rebates to homes wanting to add or upgrade their own home security. And so it shows that by understanding the community's values and aligning council budget with community voice concerns, the city is really taking meaningful action to bridge that gap between expectations and lived experience. And in the end, working towards making the community a safer and more livable place to call home. Okay, so let's move on to a topic that is becoming harder to avoid in any kind of conversation these days. It's around affordable housing. So if you joined us for our session last year, you might remember that we flagged housing affordability as a growing pressure. In 2025, 56% of Australians nominated affordable, decent housing as a key contributor to livability, right behind feeling safe. But the local experiences score was just 4.5 out of 10, which is the lowest of any attribute we measured. And again, this represents a huge disconnect. In metropolitan areas, things like high demand for housing, population growth, and stagnant housing supply do continue to drive these negative experiences. Even if you look at relatively higher scoring cities like Melbourne and Hobart, those scores are still far from satisfactory. So while regional Australia, I think, is commonly thought of as more affordable in terms of housing, the data shows that this isn't uniformly the case, and residents certainly don't have that experience necessarily. Some regional areas do outperform their metropolitan counterparts, but others, especially in parts of New South Wales and North Queensland, are certainly experiencing severe affordability challenges. So if you go down the bottom of the list, you can see that Southern New South Wales, the average housing affordability score is 3.7 out of 10, and Northern New South Wales, it's 3.9 out of 10. So in these two regions, residents are placing higher and higher importance on housing. So the level of importance they're placing on housing is increasing, showing that it's really something that's driving livability in these places in particular. And the data supports this across the nation. We're seeing that the issue is becoming more acute. So if we look at Australia, the national story first, and that's the orange bar in the graph, we can see that the importance that Australians place on affordable, decent housing is increasing year on year. So 48%, or is it 46? 46%, 52%, and 56% it continues to rise as an important issue. Then if we move over to experiences across Australia, we can see that it's becoming more and more challenging for people, both renters and people looking to buy, to secure affordable, decent housing. And what we see time and time again is that if you're a renter or a young person, the challenge is amplified. So renters across Australia make up about 30% of households, and they're the most likely to nominate affordable, decent housing as a contributor towards making somewhere a good place to live. And they also report the poorest local area experiences. Younger Australians, so those we've defined as 18 to 34 years of age, are also more likely to value housing affordability. There's a relationship here, so younger people are also more likely to rent, and so therefore the pressures are compounded. We're seeing skyrocketing rent prices, particularly over the last few years, which is resulting in unstable housing arrangements and limited options for people to enter the housing market. And the impacts of affordable, decent housing, or lack of affordable, decent housing, go well beyond housing itself. So housing security has been shown to affect our health, our sense of well-being, how confident we feel in our financial circumstances, and even our ability to meet our own basic commitments. So in terms of mental health, that's the relationship shown in the graph on the left, the orange one. People who fully own their own home have the highest assessment of their own mental health, so 7.4 out of 10 on average. If you've got a mortgaged home, so you're paying a mortgage, your mental health is lower at 6.7, and if you rent, it's as low as 6.5. A similar pattern emerges when Australians are asked to rate their own financial circumstances on a scale of 0 to 10. And we see that, again, those who fully own their own home, more financially secure compared to those who are paying a mortgage, and those who rent have much poorer assessments of their own financial circumstances. Now, of course, this makes complete sense. People that own their own home, they're at a different life stage, potentially, compared to younger generations. But we do know from other research that there is a two-way relationship between housing tenure and mental health. So poor housing can harm mental health, and poorer mental health can lead to housing instability, which can be a really tough cycle to break. But what it really signals to us is that when the average renter rates their personal financial circumstances just 4.9 out of 10, it shows that there's a cohort of the community that's under particular stress and strain. And so it's important that we keep a really close watch on those most vulnerable in the community. And certainly housing isn't just a livability issue. It's an economic issue, it's a social issue, and it's a generational equity issue. And we believe, as we've said before, that tackling it is probably the single biggest opportunity we have to improve quality of life for Australians. In the city of Ipswich, in the southwest of Brisbane, affordable, decent housing emerged as a key livability strength in 2024. So 48% of residents there considered it important, ranking third of all the 16 attributes. And experiences were pretty good. So 5.3 out of 10, while it doesn't seem high, it's significantly higher than the Southeast Queensland average and the national average. So this was data collected in 2024. In our framework, in our community views framework, this places affordable housing in the areas to maintain for Ipswich, which means it's both valued, highly valued, and relatively well delivered. And certainly the city of Ipswich has elevated housing affordability into its strategic agenda. In late 2024, the council adopted a new local housing action plan aimed at boosting housing diversity, availability and choice. It embedded housing in its city plan for 2025. And of course, it collaborates with the state government on its priority development areas. And this really shows a great understanding of the priorities of residents and underscores the local community's commitment, to ensuring that every resident can find a safe, affordable home. Okay, so from housing stress, let's switch gears and talk about something a little bit more uplifting, which is nature. When I was looking into the importance of nature to Australians and how it might differ across the world, I was struck by the extraordinary level of biodiversity that we have in Australia. We are host to over 600,000 native species, and more than 80% of the plants, reptiles and mammals we have here are not found anywhere else on Earth, which I found incredible. And we have very diverse landscapes as well, from deserts to rainforests to reefs to national parks. So we're quite fortunate in where we live. And it's no surprise then that the natural environment is part of the Australian identity and something we want to enjoy in our everyday life. According to the data, 50% of people said nature was a key part of what makes a place livable. Research consistently shows that time in nature supports physical health, lowers stress, improves mental well-being, and helps build a sense of belonging. Natural spaces also provide a place for people to meet, to interact, to participate in sports and recreation as well. And the good news is that most Australians are having positive experiences with accessing the natural environment. So the national average was 7.6 out of 10, and even higher in regional areas at 8 out of 10. And certainly some specific local areas really stood out in this regard. In southern New South Wales, locals rated their ability to access the natural environment at 8.7 out of 10, and regional Western Australians and Eastern Victorians rated their experiences 8.4. And the best performing capital city was Hobart at 8.2 out of 10. So in these areas, the natural beauty really contributes to not only amenity and lifestyle, but it forms a key part of these local identities. And the benefits of access to nature do go beyond purely aesthetics. There is a clear link here between having access to the natural environment and health and well-being. So in the Community Views survey, we ask residents to tell us how they feel about their physical health. So how they would rate their physical health on a scale between 0 to 10. And here's the relationship between whether people feel they have access to the natural environment and their own assessments of their physical health. So you can see again that people that have poor access to the natural environment tend to have poorer physical health compared to those who have really good access to the natural environment, who have higher levels of physical health. So that really reinforces this important role that nature plays in supporting healthy and active lifestyles. And I think this really tells us that protecting and improving access to nature is more than just an environmental issue. It's very much a public health priority as well. So as Australia densifies and development expands, it becomes very challenging, of course, to maintain the natural environment. So we've collected perspectives on both the benefits and the concerns that people have about residential development. So in terms of concerns, while increased traffic and congestion, strain on infrastructure and housing affordability are top of mind for concerns about changes to their local area, 28% of Australians are concerned about the potential loss of green space, and 20% are concerned about the general environmental impact that residential development will cause. And you can see here from one of these, a quote from a woman in Perth: "We desperately need native trees and greenery to provide shade and improve aesthetics and food and shelter for wildlife. The afternoons are so hot and uncomfortable." So natural environments, they don't just make places beautiful, but they also protect cities and towns from heat, pollution, flooding, all sorts of natural hazards. And poorly planned development does risk eroding both environmental resilience and community trust. Another case study with one of the local councils that we work with, so the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Here, natural environment is a really important issue. So 67% of residents told us that it was important to them. And that was significantly more important compared to the national average. Positively, the lived experience of accessing natural amenity was very positive. So residents rated their experiences 8.1 out of 10, indicating substantial level of satisfaction, and also positioning this attribute amongst the region's strongest performing areas. So reflecting this community sentiment, Sunshine Coast Council has embedded environmental stewardship into its strategic planning and on-the-ground programs. Through its environment and livability strategy, Council is advancing initiatives such as Cool Urban Forest Project to identify and cool urban hotspots, as well as expanding coastal pathway networks to support sustainable enjoyment of coastal environments. Council also champions hands-on community engagement through programs such as Bush Care, where over 1,500 volunteers annually plant native vegetation and restore bushland. So by putting strong policies in place to protect natural environments, the Sunshine Coast is taking action towards a more livable, climate resilient and future-ready community. Finally, let's talk about high quality health services. And, these are services that underpin so much of life, especially in regional and ageing communities. So in 2025, 48% of Australians said access to high quality healthcare was one of the most important livability factors, ranked 4th overall. And that level of importance has held pretty steady over the past few years, although it does seem to be increasing. Australians rated their experiences with this attribute 6.1 out of 10, making it the 7th most positively experienced attribute. And we did see a slight decline in experiences with health services since last year. But again, experience varies sharply by location. We've got a graph to show this one a little bit more clearly on the next slide. So regional Australians, you can see here, place a significantly higher value on having access to high quality health services, so 53% compared to 45% in metropolitan areas. However, they rated their experiences at just 5.6 out of 10. So this gap is really putting downward pressure on overall livability in regional and rural parts of the nation. Metropolitan Australians do generally enjoy better local area experiences of accessing health services, particularly those living in inner city local government areas. So they rate their experiences 7.3 out of 10. Now, those inner city areas do tend to host major hospitals. They have a dense network of health and community services, and they're supported by strong transport connections. If you go work further out from the city centre to middle suburban areas, experiences drop to 6.7, and in outer suburban areas, they drop again to 6.3, reflecting those kind of greater distances to major facilities. Larger regional cities, so those are cities with more than 100,000 residents, they tend to fare a bit better in terms of accessing health services, with an average rating of 6.6 out of 10. And they really benefit from the economies of scale that smaller towns don't. So you can see very clearly there from the orange graph on the right that once you move outside of a larger regional town, there are many challenges in accessing high quality health services. So there's limited infrastructure, fewer specialists, and longer wait times and travel times. Many of these smaller towns also tend to have older populations, so the median age will be older, which further increases those demand pressures. And so very much a familiar story. We see it time and time again that the further you are from a major centre, the harder it can be to access healthcare services that you might need. And certainly the need for health services does vary by age. If we start here with the top two graphs, this is the importance and experience by age group. And the importance people place on health services increases as you age. So amongst those aged 60 years or over, 61% nominate health services as important. While younger Australians are less likely to prioritise health services overall, there is a factor here in that they do tend to experience poorer levels of mental health. So this is people's assessments of their own mental health on a scale of 0 to 10. And certainly if you look at, yes, 18 to 34-year-olds, their assessments of their own mental health is much lower than older Australians. So this really highlights this kind of need to, yes, there's higher demand amongst older people, but young people are experiencing issues. There's higher demand there for mental health services as well. And certainly there is much to celebrate in terms of Australia's provision of high quality health services. Many communities benefit from strong infrastructure, skilled professionals, and integrated service networks. But of course, the data does show a clear equity gap. And you can see from the comments, the particular one at the bottom of a resident in central Queensland, which kind of sums up the sentiment. They have to travel 200 kilometres to see a specialist with a wait time of 12 months. So that kind of highlights the significant disadvantage for those smaller regional and rural areas. And these gaps, given the ageing population, these gaps are expected to widen without targeted action. Our final case study for today is Clarence Valley in northern New South Wales. So here, high quality health services ranked as an important livability priority in 2024. 51% of residents identified it as important, which was the third most important factor, and experiences were rated 4.8 out of 10, putting it as the 13th most positively experienced. So therefore, it was identified really as a key priority for elevating livability in the local area. Council, armed with this information, with this data, council can do something about it. So in its strategic plan, council has embedded, improved health and wellbeing into it. They are advocating with the state government for investment into health services, and they have a program, Our Healthy Clarence, which brings together community groups, health professionals, schools, and council to support health and wellbeing across the region. So thank you for listening to my summary of the core four, and we'll now get on to answering any questions that you may have had throughout the presentation. Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Jackie. A really nice, succinct kind of overview of the key insights we identified through the survey, explaining in more detail in the Living in Australia report, which will come out later today. I'll let you grab a breath there, Jackie. We've had lots of really nice questions come through over the last 30 minutes or so. Thanks to all of those who not only asked a question, but also some were answered in there. And so we might talk about some of those as we go. In terms of kind of the ones we can focus on here and now, we'll jump into some of those that have been upvoted. And I'll just stop sharing my screen because I will go to a different view to answer those questions. Okay, let me reshare my screen here now. What I've done here, everyone, is I've transitioned from the webinar slides into the Views ID reporting and exploratory platform. This is where we house all of the Living in Australia data and the data we collect for our councils. This will be made available to you as well. And I've already seen someone popped in the chat, the link into the chat. So thank you for doing that. You saved me from doing a job. The first question that we're going to answer comes from, comes from Glenn Searle, and it's the most popular question. So, in regards to safety and crime concerns, has any work been undertaken to match the feelings responses against crime statistics? Does a level of concern match an increase in crime? Glenn, thank you so much for the question, and those who upvoted. It's one of the things that I've been fascinated about over the last 15 years of looking at this topic. Again, if I just zoom in just to kind of really highlight the importance of feeling safe to Australians, you can see it's far over on the right hand side here. Clearly the most important thing that residents place a high value on. Now, what I have found in my analysis, Glenn, is that when there's an increase in crimes against the person, where the victim is selected at random. And when that victim looks a bit like you or looks like someone you know, or their house that looks a bit like your house or a house that you could live in, then that's what elevates the concern around crime. We received the crime stats last week from the ABS, and it did show, and I did note someone shared that in the chat, that there's a significant increase in crime in Victoria, and the types of crimes is important. So we've seen aggravated burglaries, car thefts, retail thefts increase significantly in Victoria, and I think that's playing its role. I think the other feature about people's perception of crime is just our ability to produce and consume content as it relates to crime. So if I'm just going to jump back here, um, one of the questions we ask in the survey is what could be done to advance quality of life for people in your local area. Jackie shared some of the free text comments we have available, but you do see when people talk about crime in these free text comments, and we can run an analysis over the top here. So what we're doing is we've got all those comments, and our infrastructure allows us to run an analysis over the top of them to kind of understand the kind of key themes that are coming out about crime. Is we do see that people's kind of comments often express this ability to kind of produce and consume content related to crime. So if you think about Ring cameras, you think about mobile phones, you think about how we consume media in local areas, it can actually, in some ways, elevate the representation of actual crime that's occurring or misrepresent the amount of crime that's occurring because it appears in your feeds a lot of the time. So I think that's an important feature to mention here. But yeah, just the particular types of crime, we're looking at youth crime, and as Jackie mentioned, a disaggregation between people are focused, believe the police are doing a good job, we need more law and order enforcement, but the punishments aren't suiting the crime. We could go on about crime for a long time, and maybe we'll write an article about the relationship between crime statistics and perceptions of safety. But for now, we'll move on. So the next question we've got here, or the next most popular question we've got here, sorry, is can you separate the metropolitan data between inner city and outer suburbs? It would be interesting to see the difference in experience of access to public transport and job prospects. Great question, Michelle. Thank you for sharing. Yes, we absolutely can. So while at this part of looking at the Living in Australia data, we can zoom in on particular local areas and we can kind of look at, say, how people, say, from Melbourne, rate their lived experience in comparison to people from Australia and how that's changed over time. We can go all the way down into our data explorer here. And Jackie actually shared some of the insights around kind of spatial typologies. So we're kind of looking at the data, the zeros and ones, the case level data now in our Living in Australia data set is now explorable. We make this feature also available to the councils who we work with to deliver this service. And one of the attributes we've put into the data set is the characteristics of the people who completed the survey and whether they were the type of place that they live here. So we've got the ability to say, look at a typology of place and be able to compare that with how people feel about their ability to access reliable and efficient public transport. So here's an example. And what I suspect we'll find, having not run this analysis before right now, is that those people who live in inner city areas will report more positive local area experiences for the provision of reliable and efficient public transport in comparison to those people who live in middle and outer suburban areas. So I think that's an important feature. And one of the things that we've spoken about and written about before is this idea that as we need to grow and change our communities and we need to densify our middle suburbs, it's a fair expectation that people who live in middle suburban areas will actually have an advanced quality of life through that process and that the character and amenity of where they live won't be affected. And one of the features that we see as important in contributing to that advanced quality of life as we densify the middle and then the outer suburban areas is the improvement of reliable and efficient public transport in those places. So middle suburban areas should aspire to have the lived experience of inner city residents, whereas outer suburban residents should aspire to have the lived experience of middle suburban residents. And that's how we think about that there. Michelle, I won't have a chance to jump in to job prospects, but I just wanted to show you that we can do that and you will be able to do that when you receive access to these insights. We've got a question here about methodology. Jackie, I might pass this one over to you. So can you please explain the methodology and the sampling? if you could talk about it, not only just from our Living in Australia work, but some of the work we've done for council. And I'll bring up the example of Sunshine Coast Regional Council to be able to kind of illustrate how we do that at a local area level.
Yeah, sure. So for living in Australia, the sample size is around 4,900. And the way that we set the overall sample size is we start from the kind of local areas that we want to represent first, and then we work our way up from there. So we've got our 21 local areas, and all of them have at least, they range in sample sizes from 150 up to about 450. And the way that we collect responses is via a social media advertising methodology, which is the single best methodology for reaching a small population in a cost-effective manner. So we have a community views Facebook and Instagram page. It gets promoted, the survey gets promoted to people in different local areas, so we can target people geographically. They're invited to complete the survey. It's very quick and easy to complete. And that's sort of how we collect those responses in the online survey. And we do that across all of the different clients we work with. This one in particular for the Sunshine Coast, we've surveyed 1,500 residents. I think this one's primarily through social media advertising, but when we work with an organisation or a local council, we also offer the opportunity for them to promote the survey via their own channels, which we call, so we give a clone link, and they can basically push it out through their different channels to boost what we collect through the social media advertising, and to put the survey out there into different formats to make it more accessible to a wider audience. But we find that if we conduct the survey through social media advertising, we do increase our chances of hitting people that won't necessarily follow council channels. So we go beyond those highly engaged with a local council.
Just close off there, Jax. Thanks for explaining it so well. I'll just wrap with two additional features. The first being that we work with each individual council to identify the local areas that they'd like to represent with a high conviction. So in this case, Sunshine Coast Council has these 6 planning areas they're really focused on, and we build those planning areas from the ground up. And while Jackie spoke about our desire to collect a sample that looks and feels like the population it's intended to represent, we also employ data normalization and weighting procedures as well, which is a standard feature you see in social research. We have significant differences to explain whether differences between communities or changes over time are meaningful or not. And without those two things, you can't stand behind these results with a high conviction, actually put some money and put some investment behind what we learn. And so we do focus on methodology. We love methodology questions, and we're happy we've got to answer one today. So we've run out of time. I'll close there. We've got 40 other questions in the Q&A. We'll get back to you on those over the next little while. I just wanted to thank everyone again for providing us with an hour of their time today to talk us through what we learned from the Living in Australia survey. What we'll also do from here is connect you with the webinar slides, the webinar recording, and access to the Living in Australia report, and some links to some other things that might be helpful as well. So with that all closed and finished for the day, I'd like to say thank you again. Enjoy your afternoon, and I'm sure we'll connect soon. Thank you, everyone.